A grisly scene at an eerily desolate site. Two bodies discarded like yesterday's trash.
These two young girls were dumped out like garbage next to a dumpster.
One woman shot execution style. Another woman savagely beaten to death.
The first hit pretty much did the job, and the rest of it just seemed to be overkill.
What happened?
A distraught father talking to detectives, almost inconsolable.
What happened? What happened? What happened?
And as detectives chased every lead, grieving family members gathered at a candlelight vigil. Was the sadistic killer among them a wolf in sheep's clothing? Hundreds of clues, a massive trail of breadcrumbs to follow, caught on video.
If that gentleman would have looked in the back of that car, he would have saw the two bodies.
And in the flesh.
The fingerprint changed everything.
But the biggest bombshell was about to drop.
Their damn blood is in your room.
The barbaric monster was in plain sight.
He showed me the picture, and all I said was, I shook the killer's hand.
Brittney Cosby and Crystal Jackson were both 24 years old, living in Houston, Texas, and in love with each other. For 2 years, life was good for the young couple. Both were ambitious, hardworking, and raising Crystal's 5-year-old daughter, Zanaya, as Crystal's parents tell our Andrea Isom.
Crystal and Brittney were happy.
Yes, they were.
Yeah, they was two
Peas in a pot.
peas in a pot.
They'd been living with Brittney's 90-year-old great-grandmother, Annie Lee Cosby, her dad's grandmother, helping her with the chores, errands, and paying bills. Crystal had been raised by her parents, Reverend Ivan and Mary Jackson. Brittney had been raised by her great-grandmother. Her mom, Loranda McDonald, and dad, James Cosby, split when she was young. James was back living in the same house.
Brittney and Crystal were kind of in a routine as far as taking care of Mrs. Cosby and going to work. And James Cosby came back into the house and was working sporadically.
Brittney and Crystal hoped to move out and get a place of their own. They first needed a car. Pooling their tax refunds, they finally bought a 2006 Kia Sorento with Brittney's great-grandmother co-signing. A few days later, they went over to Crystal's parents' house to pick up Zanaya and show off their new purchase.
She wanted me to come out to see her new car. Me being as stubborn as I am, I wouldn't even get up out the chair because I told her not to get the vehicle in the first place. But the night that she left the house, all I could do was look at her until I loved her. And my daughter said, Dad, I love you too, bye.
As they drove off that night, little did the Jacksons know that would be the last time they'd see their daughter Crystal and her girlfriend Brittney alive. The next morning and throughout the day, Mary called Crystal several times but got no answer. And Mary, who worked at Zanaya's school, learned she hadn't been in that day either.
When did you start to worry?
Late on at night, my husband said, something don't feel right.
That evening, Ivan and Mary went to Brittney's house looking for Crystal. Zanaya was there, Crystal was not. Night turned to day. Then, total panic set in.
I called whatever hospital came to my mind, police stations that I could think of. Then I told my husband, well, let's just call the dreaded morgue. No signs of her there. I said, okay, that's a good thing.
It's a good thing,
But
yeah.
where are you, child? I'm saying to them, I said, where you at?
As worry grew in the Jackson house, about an hour and a half away in Port Bolivar, an unincorporated community in Galveston County, a delivery driver stumbled upon an unbelievably horrific scene.
The beer delivery driver went to throw his boxes in the dumpster. When he came back in the store, he asked the clerk if they had thrown out mannequins, because there were mannequins by the dumpster, and so she went to look. That's when they realized they were actually bodies.
The clerk called the cops, and when they arrived, they walked up on a truly macabre scene.
The first thing that I noticed is just the emptiness of it. The hotel itself is abandoned. There's nothing around it. It's boarded up with plywood on all the windows. Just the emptiness of it resounded with me.
The bodies were found intertwined and strewn like rag dolls.
How bad was it?
It was a pretty gruesome sight. I mean, it really was. It didn't look like something that somebody tried to cover up. It really looked like somebody just wanted to dump them off, get them out, and get out of there.
Even veteran investigators were stunned at the sheer brutality. Who could have committed such a horrendous act? One woman found face up, eyes open with a severe wound to the head.
First body that we saw as we approached had a very big-sized gunshot wound to her head. It was very visible.
The other woman was found lying on her stomach. Shockingly, a bed sheet was wrapped around her head. As cops pull it back, they see the results of a brutal beating.
Her head was pretty much trashed. The first hit was enough to kill her and break her neck. It fractured her skull. It actually split her suture from one side all the way across to the other. It just seemed to be overkill.
The sheet, what does that mean? What does that tell us?
Usually if a person commits a crime as heinous as this, they don't really want to see the face of their victim.
Speculation swirled. Was it a hate crime or a crime of passion at the hands of a former lover? Investigators quickly determined the women were killed at another location and dumped in Port Bolivar. But where were they killed? And who were they? Cops were desperately trying to learn their identities.
We had no idea who they were. They didn't appear to be local, so we didn't know exactly where they had come from.
As investigators processed the scene, they found many items, and among them, a possible clue. A piece of mail with a name on it. Would that name lead them in the right direction or take them down a dead-end road? 2 young women found murdered. One shot in the head, the other beaten to death, her face covered with a bedsheet.
It was a pretty gruesome sight.
Their bodies had been mercilessly dumped in Port Bolivar, Galveston County, but investigators believe the murders happened elsewhere. Detectives scrutinized the scene, finding 3 blood-spattered wood boards in a blood-stained envelope. On that envelope, an address, Houcher Street in Houston, and a name, Brittney Cosby. At the Houston address, investigators informed Brittney's 90-year-old great-grandmother, Annie Lee Cosby, and her father, James Cosby, of her tragic demise.
What happened?
That's what we're trying to find out.
James, I know we're hitting you with a lot. Take a minute, but we're going to really need to talk to you so you can help us so we can find out who did this, okay?
What happened?
You grieve all you need to grieve, we understand.
And they quickly learned the other woman's identity.
See what's the girl with the girlfriend?
That's her girlfriend, that Crystal.
What kind of vehicle do they have?
It's a Kia.
A Kia.
It's a Kia. It's a Kia SUV.
That night, Crystal's parents called everywhere trying to find her. Unfortunately, their worst fears were soon confirmed.
Hearing those words, that Crystal's gone.
It was a devastating blow, and there's just no other words could describe how we felt.
Complete heartbreak, not only for them, but for Crystal's 5-year-old daughter, Zanaya. Brittney's mother, Loranda McDonald, found out on social media.
My sister then was going through Facebook, and it had on there, R.I.P. Brittney. And then she was like, is Brittney dead? And I said, don't tell me that, please don't tell me that. I didn't even want to let my mama. That hurt right bad. That was my only girl.
Investigators working around the clock caught a much-needed break. A man found a wallet on a dirt road and notified the sheriff's department.
A gentleman was walking his dog and found this wallet, mailed it back, and then later realized that the name on the driver's license was one of the missing females.
It was Brittney's. Investigators theorized that the dirt road close to Brittney's house may have been the first intended dump site. 2 days later, they talked again with Brittney's father, James Cosby, hoping to clarify the timeline.
You told me last you saw Brittney was a Wednesday night?
No.
Thursday morning?
Yeah.
What time did Crystal and Brittney leave?
The same time they usually leave every morning. It was like just a normal morning. Nothing was out of the ordinary.
But detectives were puzzled. Why did the women leave that morning without taking Crystal's daughter, Zanaya, to school?
That's the one thing that's out of the ordinary that we're trying to figure out. That's because if normally they would take her to school, but yet they left her there that morning. No, man, I know you're doing the best you can. And as things come up, you know you got my number, so you call anytime.
Detectives believed one of the keys to finding Brittney and Crystal's killer was finding their SUV. They pulled surveillance videos from a couple of key locations. First, the liquor store near the house.
We were able to get surveillance video from the liquor store that showed that vehicle leaving early that morning, which is when we think the homicide first occurred. We also were able to find it leaving that evening on the way to Galveston.
Then, surveillance video from the Galveston ferry landing. On the tape, visual proof that around 9 p.m. that night, a man was stopped by ferry security in an SUV believed to match the lady's Kia Sorento.
He was approached by the security officer who told him that the headlight was out on the vehicle. At that time, he exited the vehicle, came around to the front, examining the light.
Investigators believe Brittney and Crystal's bodies were in the back of that SUV at the time, but the driver sets off no alarms.
If that gentleman would have looked in the back of that car, he would have saw the two bodies.
But the guard does offer up a strong description, leading to a composite sketch. Was this their killer? 6 days after Brittney and Crystal were murdered, an absolute game changer. A fingerprint found at the site where the bodies were dumped comes back with a match. The results? Enough to shock everyone. That lone fingerprint is a perfect match to Brittney's own dad.
I called Detective Kitchens and I was like, I told him, I said, this is the fingerprint I have. It's James Cosby, who is that? And he said, that's the father. That's Brittney's dad.
It was a stunning realization. The man detectives had only seen as the grieving father was now their prime suspect. When investigators returned to the home, James wasn't there, but his grandmother's caregiver shared some valuable information.
She described a lot of things that were different in the house and outside the house.
With a search warrant in hand, investigators bring the forensics team to the house. At the same moment, just blocks away, a vigil is underway to grieve the two women.
You can't really put something like this into words.
Friends, family, and grieving father James Cosby gathered at a candlelight vigil to remember Brittney and Crystal. Captured here by local news.
Brittney's a good child. She's my baby.
Little did James know what was going on back at the home. Outside, under the carport, blood spots and a missing shutter, which matched one found with the bodies.
His bedroom is adjacent to that carport. On the outside of this house, there was false shutters that were on the main windows, which one was missing. That shutter was found in Bolivar with the bodies.
Just inside the door, in the den where James slept, signs of a bloodbath.
Everywhere we were looking, we were finding something with blood on it. Tiny drops, bigger drops, pools, swipe marks. They were in the door, they were on the carpet, on the couch, on clothes that were in the room.
And when we talk about amount, you're talking massive.
Yes, ma'am. At her autopsy, her body was just about empty of her blood, so she bled out in that room.
And when investigators sprayed the room with chemicals to detect human blood invisible to the naked eye, the room lit up like a 4th of July sky.
He tried to clean it up.
He tried. He put smaller rugs on top of the blood stains, which, that's not gonna do it.
Detectives also uncovered a box of bullets with a mix of .38 and .357 shells. They believed the murder weapon was a .357, and the bullet which killed Crystal was a .38.
This is the most evidence I've ever collected on a crime scene.
How much?
307 individual pieces. And 290 of them said it was James Cosby that committed the crime.
Back at the vigil, James Cosby pleads for the public's help in finding the killer.
We need to find out what's happening. The detectives are doing what they do. They've been keeping us informed as much as they can, but, there's nothing yet.
But Cosby had no clue there definitely was something. And though the vigil was coming to an end, the questions were just beginning for James Cosby.
They ended up picking him up at the vigil. This is not looking good for Mr. Cosby.
Based on all the evidence collected, detectives deduced that sometime in the early morning hours, as Crystal's daughter sat in the car waiting to be taken to school, James got into a fight with Brittney, savagely beating her to death. They believed Crystal walked in while it was happening, and he shot her. Zanaya wandered back into the house from the car, staying with the dead women for hours. James Cosby then spent the day with his girlfriend. And at some point, James put Brittney and Crystal in the back of their own SUV and drove to Port Bolivar, where he dumped their bodies.
Tried to cover it up.
Do you think he thought he got away with it?
I think he was believing he was headed that way.
No one in Houston, Texas could understand why someone had brutally murdered lovers Brittney Cosby and Crystal Jackson. That is, until police closed in on Brittney's own father, James Cosby.
There was blood everywhere in that room.
Cops found a bloodbath of evidence in his home, and at the very same moment, the unthinkable. James Cosby soaking up sympathy, playing the part of the grieving father at the candlelight vigil. But before he can leave, detectives intercept, taking him in for questioning.
This is your daughter. What happened?
That's what we're trying to find out.
Cosby was no stranger to an interrogation room. He'd been in and out of prison for most of Brittney's young life, the last time for failing to register as a sex offender. The suspect they've been seeking was now in their clutches.
I don't want y'all to look at me as a suspect.
After James is advised of his rights, an aggressive and stunning 5.5-hour cat and mouse game begins.
I've been watching enough TV shows to know that they say Miranda rights. That means you under arrest.
No, it doesn't
mean you're under arrest.
It sure don't.
All it is, you've been given your rights.
That's all I see on Perry Mason.
Why would somebody want to do this to them?
I've been asking myself that question too. How much longer are we going to be doing that?
I don't know. Too much longer. Yeah.
Were you aware that we were back at the house today?
Today?
Investigators confront Cosby with the mountain of evidence against him, like his fingerprint on a piece of paper stuck to one of the boards found with the bodies.
Can you explain to me how your print wound up on some of that over there where those bodies were recovered in Port Bolivar, Texas?
My print was on what?
The scene.
The scene. Can you explain to me why or how in your room where you stay that carpet throughout that room and furniture throughout that room is saturated with fresh blood?
James doesn't seem to have much of an explanation for his blood-soaked room.
You've been in that room, sleeping in that room, with your daughter's blood on the carpet. Jesus, that's horrible.
Judge, there's no way
I'm
you
not looking
could
at
have
it the way
seen
you're
it.
looking at it because I didn't know that that was like that. You say I'm
You can't miss it. I seen it as soon as I walked in there.
I ain't seen no stain. I would see some stain.
She had the supreme beat out of her.
And it's all over your room.
Okay, so
Brittney had her brains beat in.
Hoping to push Cosby's emotional buttons, Lieutenant Hansen leaves, returning with the gruesome photos of the murdered women.
You explain that. You explain it. That's your daughter's head smashed in. You explain it. You explain it. Throw it away like a garbage.
Cops take a break, leaving Cosby alone. For almost 15 minutes, he fixates on the crime scene photos. Detectives watch him intently from another room.
He would stare at the crime scene photos of his daughter's body and Crystal's body and just stare at them, and we thought maybe he would confess.
A confession is exactly what they're after, but can they get it? Investigators go back for round 2.
I can't tell you why it happened.
Why not?
Now, the interrogation takes an even more grisly turn.
That's your daughter. This is your daughter's brains coming out of the hole in her head.
And James, you did it.
And you did it.
You did it.
That is your own daughter. Your own daughter. Look at this camera and show some remorse.
Remember, this was the devastated father with the Oscar-worthy performance for detectives.
What happened?
But here, James doesn't crack, and detectives go for the jugular.
What else we found on the scene? James Larry Cosby Jr.'s
sheets wrapped around his daughter's head. Everything points back to James Larry Cosby Jr. And you expect us to believe that James Larry Cosby Jr. don't know? You need to man up. What happened to your daughter? What happened to her, James?
Man, you ain't gonna scream at me. I heard. That's the sheet I sleep on. Well, the sheet I used to sleep on.
You wrap her up because you couldn't stand to look at her face and see what was done? What happened, James? Ain't nobody wants to admit to killing their own child. Nobody wants to admit that.
You think?
Who else was there? Nobody was there. So that just leaves who? You.
Nobody was there but me and Granny, that's it.
So either you killed her or Granny killed her. Well, we know Granny didn't kill her.
James, finish the sentence for me. I'm going to start a sentence. I want you to finish it.
What is it?
I did not do this because...
I'm not finishing that.
Because you did it.
With a mountain of evidence against him, James Cosby was under intense interrogation for the heinous murder of his daughter Brittney Cosby and her girlfriend Crystal Jackson.
I'm going to start a sentence. I want you to finish it.
What is it?
I did not do this because...
I'm not finishing that.
Because you can't.
Because you did it. Did you enjoy seeing her squirm around? Bleed like a pig? Did you enjoy killing your daughter?
Was she crying out to you when you were beating her to death?
More than 5 hours in, James Cosby's opportunity to come clean was closing in.
We fixed to walk out this door in a few minutes, and that's it. No more chances. It's over. The wrath of God is fixed to fall upon you. We're going to give you 15 minutes to think about what you want to do. And all deals are off after that. All deals.
Would James Cosby confess and show remorse?
Or what are you going to tell us?
Nothing.
Okay. Fine. We done?
We're done.
Stand up. Hands on your back.
A confession was off the table, but an arrest wasn't. Cops charged James with 2 counts of tampering with evidence, all they could hold him on at the time. Long hours spent with James left an indelible impression.
I've interviewed serial killers and child killers, and when I sat across from Mr. Cosby that day in that 5.5-hour interview, I'll rank him as probably one of the most cold-blooded people I ever looked eye to eye with.
James Cosby wouldn't crack, but soon a confession would be irrelevant. Just 1 month later, Crystal and Brittney's SUV was found. Detectives believe James Cosby used the vehicle to transport the women's bodies from the murder scene at their Houston home to the dump site in Port Bolivar. Inside, more damaging evidence, a bullet, and a lot of blood.
What about blood evidence inside their car?
It showed you that Crystal's body was on the left side of the cargo area, and Brittney's body was on the right side of the cargo area. We believe there was a mat back there, but it had been destroyed or thrown away, probably with the murder weapon.
1 year later, James Cosby was charged with capital murder. Grief-stricken family members were horrified. Even as they united to find the killer, he was right under their nose.
He called me on my cell and asked me, could we donate money towards Brittney's funeral? We still didn't know that he was the perpetrator.
Investigators knew how and where Brittney and Crystal were killed, but the why, the motive.
Why do you think he did it?
We think it's jealousy. He just gotten out of prison in October. He's living on Grandma's sofa. He come home, his daughter, she was running everything, had a great job. Proud of having her first vehicle. You know, she's eating at fancy restaurants, he's eating bologna sandwiches. I think it got to be a struggle over power at the house.
I cannot fathom how a father can do that to a child.
And unfortunately, Crystal was just at the wrong place at the wrong time.
I think Crystal was collateral damage.
Ebony McDade, James's sister, said things were tense 2 days before the murders.
Brittney called me to tell me about an argument that her and her father had. And my advice to her was just stay out of his way. That was the last conversation I had.
Unfortunately, that advice was not heeded. James Cosby went on trial, and after 3 hours of deliberations, the jury found him guilty of capital murder.
When you heard the verdict?
I cried because I wanted him to get death penalty.
James Cosby was sentenced to life without parole.
I never saw James as a violent person. The person who they have now doing life in prison, I don't know that person.
The youngest victim in this tragedy is Crystal's daughter, Zanaya, who was there the morning her mother and Brittney were murdered. She likely heard the shot that killed her mother.
Do you remember that day, Zanaya?
Yeah.
Tell me what you remember.
My mom went inside the house to go get for Brittney. I was about to get out the car. Guess who came running in?
Who?
James Cosby. Coming to the car, getting the keys out.
And what happened after that?
And then after that, I just went out the car with him. I went, do you know where my mom is? She said, maybe in one of those rooms. And I asked him, may I check in your room? And then he was like, no, like in this mean voice.
Did you hear anything, Zanaya?
Yeah.
What did you hear?
Like, bzzz, something like that. And then I just heard, pew, something like that.
How much do you miss your mommy?
Maybe the last number of all of the numbers, that's the highest number.
That's how much you miss your mommy?
Mm-hmm.
The tragedy has left both families picking up the pieces. Hopefully, one day, they will get some answers.
I want to ask James Larry Cosby, why was the purpose of killing our child? My only girl and your only daughter. I just want to know the answer. I do.
Galveston sheriffs are simply relieved he will never walk free again.
To Mr. James Larry Cosby. Detective Kitchens, you say what?
We got you.
James Cosby is appealing the case. We reached out to him for a jailhouse interview to try and confirm what really motivated this unthinkable crime. Unfortunately, he declined our request.